The Bible is often presented as a book filled with divine wisdom and eternal truth. But one of its boldest claims is that it contains prophecies, predictions that supposedly prove it is inspired by God. For centuries, believers have pointed to these so-called prophecies as evidence that the Bible is not just another book written by men, but the literal word of a supernatural being. The problem is, when you actually examine these prophecies closely, many of them are not just inaccurate, but downright laughable. They don't stand up to scrutiny, and in fact, many of them collapse under the weight of history and reality itself. One of the easiest places to start is with the prophecy about the return of Jesus. In the New Testament, Jesus repeatedly tells his followers that he will come back soon, within their own lifetime. In the Gospel of Matthew, he says clearly that some standing here will not taste death before the Son of Man comes in his kingdom. In plain language, that means some of his listeners were supposed to witness the end of the world with their own eyes. But here we are 2,000 years later, and not only did that never happen, but every single one of those people died waiting. If this were any other book, if some random man on the street made such a prediction and it failed, we would laugh it off and call it nonsense. Yet in religion, somehow people twist the meaning, reinterpret it, or push it into the future to avoid admitting the obvious. The prophecy failed. It is like someone telling you the world will end this week, and when it doesn't, they just keep saying, well, maybe next week, maybe next year, maybe someday. How many times do you have to move the goalpost before you realize the claim was wrong from the beginning? Another example comes from the Old Testament, with the prophecy about the city of Tyre. The prophet Ezekiel claimed that Tyre would be destroyed and never rebuilt. He even gave detailed predictions, saying that the city would be scraped bare like a rock, and fishermen would spread their nets over it. At first glance, that might sound impressive, but history tells us a very different story. Tyre was attacked by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, just as Ezekiel described, but it was not destroyed. The city survived, and it continued to thrive for centuries after Ezekiel's time. Later, Alexander the Great attacked it, and yes, he did some major damage, but even then, Tyre was rebuilt. In fact, Tyre still exists today in modern Lebanon. People live there, work there, raise families there. It has restaurants, shops, and buildings. The prophecy said it would never be rebuilt, but here it is, a living city. You can literally book a plane ticket and visit the very place the Bible said would be gone forever. That's not prophecy. That's just a failed prediction that history has completely disproved. And then there is the prophecy about Egypt in Ezekiel 29. The prophet says Egypt will be made into a desolate wasteland, uninhabited for 40 years. He goes further, claiming that Egypt would never again rule over other nations. Now, here's the problem. Egypt was never abandoned for 40 years. There is no historical record of Egypt being empty, no evidence that its people vanished, or that its land became completely uninhabited. Egyptians lived continuously in their land, farming, trading, and building. As for ruling other nations, Egypt did continue to have influence after Ezekiel's time, including during the period of the Persians, and later under Greek and Roman control. This prophecy is another example of someone making bold predictions without any connection to reality. Imagine someone today saying that America will be completely uninhabited for 40 years. If nothing like that happens, would anyone still call it prophecy? Or would we call it a failure? The Bible also makes predictions about the end times that are strangely vague and absurdly flexible. The book of Revelation is filled with wild imagery about beasts, dragons, numbers, and stars falling from the sky. Christians throughout history have claimed again and again that these prophecies were about to be fulfilled in their own generation. In the Middle Ages, people were convinced that Revelation was describing their time. During the Black Death, they thought it was the end of the world. In the 1800s, preachers like William Miller claimed the prophecies showed Jesus was about to return in 1844. When nothing happened, it became known as the Great Disappointment. And even today, televangelists and doomsday preachers point to Revelation as if it's a roadmap to the future, always sure the end is near. But the truth is, Revelation has been wrong every single time people tried to apply it. The vagueness of the language allows endless reinterpretation, but never once has it matched reality. A real prophecy should not be something you can keep twisting to fit every new crisis. That's not prediction. That's just playing with words. Then there are the prophecies that sound impressive until you realize they were written after the events had already happened. One famous example is the so-called prophecy in the book of Daniel about the rise and fall of empires. The text describes the Babylonian, Persian, and Greek empires with remarkable accuracy. At first glance, this seems amazing. How could Daniel have known all this centuries before it happened? But scholars have shown that the book of Daniel was not actually written during the Babylonian exile, as it claims. Instead, it was written much later, during the time of the Greek Empire. That means these so-called prophecies were written after the fact, which makes them no more impressive than me writing today that World War II happened and then calling it prophecy. Anyone can predict the past. The real challenge is predicting the future, and that is where the Bible consistently fails. Another laughable prophecy is found in Isaiah, where it says that the desert will bloom and blossom when God's people return to the land of Israel. Believers point to the modern state of Israel as proof that this prophecy has come true. But let's be honest here. The desert does not bloom because of some ancient text. It blooms because of modern irrigation technology, hard work, and science. Israel has made the desert productive not through divine prophecy, but through agricultural innovation, water pipelines, and drip irrigation systems invented in the 20th century. To call that a prophecy is to ignore the very real human effort and science that made it happen. If prophecy means waiting thousands of years and then relying on modern engineering to make it come true, that is not prophecy at all. And what about the prophecy that the Messiah would be born of a virgin, supposedly in Bethlehem, and that he would fulfill dozens of Old Testament predictions? At first glance, Christians love to present these as amazing evidence for Jesus. But when you look closely, the virgin birth claim comes from a mistranslation. In the Hebrew Bible, the word used in Isaiah 7:14 means young woman, not virgin. It was only later, when the text was translated into Greek, that it was turned into virgin. That means the entire prophecy of the virgin birth is built on a mistranslation. As for Bethlehem, the Gospel of Matthew claims Jesus was born there to fulfill prophecy, but the Gospel of Luke gives a completely different story about how he ended up there. The stories don't match, and historians widely agree that Jesus was probably born in Nazareth, not Bethlehem. These so-called fulfilled prophecies are not genuine predictions, but stories written to fit the mold, retroactively constructed to make it look like Jesus fulfilled them. That would be like me saying there's an ancient prophecy that a great leader would be born in New York, and then 2,000 years later, people write stories claiming that leader was from New York, even if he wasn't. That's not fulfillment, that's rewriting history. The Bible also contains prophecies that are so vague and untestable that they can mean almost anything. For example, Jeremiah says that God will destroy nations that refuse to serve Babylon. That might sound specific, but Babylon eventually fell itself. It is no longer a world power, so how does that prophecy make sense? Or take Jesus saying there will always be wars and rumors of wars before the end. Well, of course there will always be wars. That is like predicting that someday it will rain. It is not prophecy, it is stating the obvious. Anyone could say that and be correct at any point in history. These are not divine insights, they are common sense dressed up as prophecy. Perhaps one of the most laughable things about biblical prophecy is how often it requires mental gymnastics to defend. When a prophecy fails, believers rarely admit it. Instead, they stretch the meaning, reinterpret the words, or claim it will happen someday in the future. It is always just around the corner, always almost here, but never actually arriving. This is the same tactic fortune tellers and psychics use. If their prediction fails, they say, "Oh, it didn't fail. You just misunderstood, or the timing is different, or it was meant in a spiritual sense." But if a prophecy cannot be tested, if it cannot be clearly proven or disproven, then it is not meaningful at all. It becomes nothing more than vague words that can be twisted endlessly to mean anything. One of the most striking failed prophecies comes from Jesus himself when he predicts the end of the world in his own generation. He tells his followers in Matthew 24 that the sun will be darkened, the stars will fall, the heavens will shake, and he will return with power and glory before that generation passes away. Now, when he says, "This generation will not pass away until all these things have happened," it is hard to interpret that any other way. He meant the people listening to him right there. But those people died, and the world continued as it always had. Christians today try to claim that generation means something different, or that Jesus was talking about some far-off future event, but that is twisting the text. If I say that something will happen before your generation dies, and 2,000 years go by without it happening, you would be right to say I was wrong. This prophecy is laughable because it was clear, specific, and it failed completely. There is also the prophecy about the destruction of Damascus in Isaiah 17. It says, Damascus will no longer be a city, but will become a heap of ruins. Now, Damascus is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. People have been living there for over 4,000 years, and they are still living there today. It has gone through wars, conquests, and rebuilding, but it has never ceased to be a city. It is still the capital of Syria, still home to millions of people, still functioning. The Bible said it would become a heap of ruins and never recover, but history has laughed in the face of that prediction. If a modern prophet today claimed that London or Paris would soon be abandoned forever, and 500 years later those cities were still thriving, we would all agree that prophet was wrong. Yet when it comes to the Bible, people hesitate to admit the obvious. Another famous prophecy is the one about the second coming being preceded by cosmic signs like stars falling from the sky. In Mark 13, Jesus says the stars will fall and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. But we know today that stars are massive burning suns, millions of times larger than Earth, located light years away. To suggest they will fall to the Earth shows a complete lack of understanding of the universe. It is like predicting that skyscrapers on another planet will fall into your backyard. It makes no sense. At best, this reflects the ancient worldview where people believed stars were tiny lights stuck to the sky dome above the Earth. This is not prophecy. It is ignorance of basic astronomy. And yet many Christians still read this as if it is meaningful, despite the fact that we now know the universe is far larger and more complex than the biblical writers imagined. Some prophecies are even more absurd when you look at how Christians interpret them. Take the prophecy in Isaiah that supposedly predicts Cyrus, the king of Persia, by name more than 100 years before he lived. Believers call this miraculous, but scholars point out that the section of Isaiah mentioning Cyrus was written during or after his lifetime, not before. It was a later edition, written by what scholars call Second Isaiah. That means it was not a prophecy at all, but history rewritten as if it had been predicted. It would be like me writing today that George Washington would lead America to independence, and then claiming I had predicted it centuries earlier. That's not prophecy, that's cheating. Another area where biblical prophecy falls apart is in its predictions about Israel. The Bible repeatedly claims that the Jewish people will always be safe if they obey God, and destroyed if they do not. It presents their history as a cycle of punishment and restoration. But when we look at history, we see Jewish people scattered across the globe, persecuted, expelled, and even subjected to atrocities like the Holocaust. Where was the prophetic protection? Believers claim that the return of Jews to Israel in the 20th century is a fulfillment of prophecy, but this ignores centuries of suffering that the prophecy never accounted for. And as I said earlier, the blooming of the desert is not a miracle, but the result of science and technology. If prophecy is supposed to show divine foreknowledge, it should not need to be rescued by human engineering. There are also prophecies that were written so vaguely they can be applied to almost anything. Take the book of Revelation again, with its mysterious number 666, the mark of the beast. For 2,000 years, people have claimed to know who the beast is. In the past, they said it was Nero, or the Pope, or Napoleon, or Hitler, or even modern political figures. In recent years, some have said it's Barack Obama, or Bill Gates, or whoever they dislike politically. The problem is, if a prophecy can be applied to anyone and anything, then it has no real predictive power. It becomes nothing more than a Rorschach test, where people see whatever they want to see. That is not evidence of divine foresight, it is evidence of human imagination. One particularly strange prophecy comes from Isaiah 11, which says that when the Messiah comes, the wolf will live with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the goat, and the lion will eat straw like the ox. This is presented as a vision of a future paradise, a kind of utopia. But think about it for a moment. Lions eating straw? Wolves living peacefully with lambs? This is not a prophecy of something real. It is a fantasy. It is no different than saying that in the future, cats will play chess and fish will ride bicycles. It sounds poetic, but it has no connection to reality. Lions are carnivores by nature, designed to eat meat. If they tried to live on straw, they would die. This is not prophecy. It is a fairy tale picture of a world that ignores biology. There are even laughable prophecies about simple geography. For example, Ezekiel 26 says Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, will destroy Tyre. But history records that Nebuchadnezzar besieged Tyre for 13 years and failed. He never destroyed it. Later, Alexander the Great did conquer Tyre, but that was 200 years after Ezekiel. Believers claim that this fulfills the prophecy, but the prophecy specifically said Nebuchadnezzar would do it. That is like me predicting that a certain football team will win the World Cup this year, and when they lose, claiming that another team winning 2 centuries later counts as fulfillment. That's not how prophecy works. Another example is found in the prophecy about Jesus' return in 1 Thessalonians. Paul tells the early Christians that they will be alive to see it, saying, "We who are still alive and are left will be caught up together with them in the clouds." Paul genuinely believed he would live to see the return of Jesus. But of course he died nearly 2,000 years ago, and nothing happened. This is another failed prophecy, yet Christians today still read these verses as if they apply to the future. If Paul was wrong, why should anyone believe his other claims about divine revelation? Perhaps the most laughable aspect of biblical prophecy is how much effort has gone into defending it over the centuries. Scholars, pastors, and apologists twist themselves into knots to explain away failures. They say some prophecies are symbolic, others are spiritual, and some will happen someday in the future. But if prophecy can mean anything, then it means nothing. A real prophecy should be specific, testable, and clearly fulfilled in reality. Otherwise, it is no different than the vague predictions of fortune cookies or horoscopes. If you think about it, what makes these prophecies laughable is not just that they failed, but that people continue to defend them against all evidence. Imagine if someone today predicted that New York would be destroyed and never rebuilt. If 500 years passed and New York was still thriving, people would laugh at the prophecy and move on. But with the Bible, believers hold on to it, reinterpret it, and insist that somehow, someday, it will all make sense. It is like a bad magician whose tricks keep failing, but the audience is so desperate to believe in magic that they clap anyway. The truth is, biblical prophecy does not reveal divine knowledge. It reveals the human desire for certainty, the need to believe that history has a plan, and the hope that someone out there is in control. People want to believe that their struggles and suffering have meaning, that their nation will be restored, that their enemies will fall, and that justice will come. Prophecy gives them that hope, even when it is false. That is why failed prophecies don't kill faith. Instead, they are reinterpreted and recycled for the next generation. But if we take a step back and look honestly, these so-called prophecies are not evidence of anything supernatural. They are failed guesses, vague poetry, and stories rewritten after the fact. And when compared to the reality of history and science, they are not just wrong, they are laughable. So the next time someone tells you that the Bible proves itself through prophecy, remember Tyre, Damascus, Egypt, Bethlehem, Revelation, and all the others. Remember that none of these predictions stand up to scrutiny, and ask yourself a simple question. If the Bible was truly written by an all-knowing God, would its prophecies look like this? Or would they actually predict something specific, clear, and undeniable? The answer is obvious. What we see in the Bible is not prophecy. It is the imagination of ancient people trying to make sense of their world. And that is why the most laughable prophecies in the Bible are not divine at all. They are human, and they fail just like human guesses always do.